Is this little thing gonna ruin all the Eternal formats? Let's take a look and see what the data actually has to say. Hello folks, Phil Gallagher, aka ThrabenU here for not exactly a legacy video. Today I want to kind of have a serious data-driven talk about this new Lord of the Rings set, because it is kind of being hailed as like Modern Horizons 3 in terms of the impact that it is having on various formats. And as various content creators like myself end up trying out a lot of new cards, it puts this huge spotlight on new powerful things that are potentially broken. Well, how broken are they really in reality? I want to take a look at that today. So, kind of what my plan is I want to look at data across multiple formats and actually show you based on tournament results the impact that these things are having. Because the perceived impact that the community is having from this set is just like absolutely massive. But in reality, is that what's actually happening? Let's go ahead and start with our oldest and most broken format, Vintage. So, the two cards that people are most hailing as potentially broken in this format, or really in all of the formats, are Orcish Bowmasters and the One Ring. Both of these are very powerful, especially within the context of older formats where cantrips are going to be powerful. And that's not to say that there aren't other players in older formats, because there certainly are. Because cards like 4th Eorlingas are showing up as finishers in initiative decks, and a little bit in control and tempo decks as well, while cards like Delighted Halfling are often ramping you into things like Teferi and the One Ring. Alright, let's talk about Vintage specifically first. And with Vintage, we've kind of got two major data points right now. We have the regular old data from leagues, that is what deck lists are 5-0ing, and then we have the data from Vintage challenges, of which at the time of this recording, we've got two, the ones for the first weekend of July. So, good news. As far as Orcish Bowmasters goes in Vintage, the card seems pretty mid. It had 5 different 5-0 finishes in leagues out of 14 deck lists, so roughly a third of the decks that 5-0'd are testing out Orcish Bowmasters. And while that's a decently high percentage, I don't think that's anything to be overly alarmed about. People are going to be trying new cards. That is totally to be expected. Notably, while we are still talking about league finishes here, the One Ring did not have any 5-0 league finishes to its name. Now, we'll put a little caveat next to that data here. The One Ring was over 100 ticks at the time. Card availability might have been a partial issue, but people were absolutely jamming games with this card early on, so I was honestly surprised when I saw that data myself. All right, back to Orcish Bowmasters now. It had one challenge top 8 over the weekend between two events, which is not impressive really at all. That is just completely average. If I was not specifically looking for that, I wouldn't even have noticed that looking at the data, right? And in total, over the top 32 of two events, that is 64 total deck lists, there were only 7 decks that contained Orcish Bowmasters. So Orcish Bowmasters in Vintage seems totally norm, just not something that we need to worry about, at least for right now. Well, what about the One Ring in Vintage? Because, the One Ring is a turn 1 play by Vintage standards, because you just have lands that tap for 3 mana. So you would expect that it would potentially be broken there and go on the long list of artifacts that end up being restricted in the format. As far as the data goes, the deck did get 2 top 8 finishes over the weekend, and we're going to take a look at a couple of lists real quick. And a total of 8 appearances, again, over the course of 64 deck lists. Not exactly a scary number. Let's go ahead and take a look at the form these One Ring decks are taking in Vintage. The first deck list here is essentially a paradoxical outcome deck list that is looking to bounce a bunch of artifacts so you can draw a whole bunch of cards. And this deck is something that is also playing Coveted Jewel, which is somewhere between a colorless Black Lotus that you can reuse and an Ancestral Recall. It's a little bit of a weird card, but you get away with playing some very expensive things when Mishra's Workshop gets involved. And the One Ring slots pretty easily into this shell. Would I call the One Ring the most broken thing here? No. No, I certainly would not. And this is essentially just an existing deck list that shoved 4 copies of the One Ring into it. Um, I'm not too worried about this. It seems like a strong deck, but PO in some form has existed and has been strong for years and years and years at this point. It's not like this was a new breakout deck, just built totally around the One Ring that busted the format wide open. And if you don't necessarily want to go kind of the more combo route, you can just go the fair route and play Golos shops, where you try to get extra copies of Mishra's Workshop into play to power out these various cards. And this also put up good results with copies of the One Ring. Again, though, I don't really feel like I'm worried about this deck. And let me explain why I'm not worried about either one of these things by vintage standards, despite the fact that, like, there are some okay results with this in early challenges. Vintage is a format of answers. In addition to just some of the most flexible things ever printed, like, say, Force of Will, you also just have access to things like Oko or Dakfaden. Shut off your opponent's One Ring or take it for yourself. And this is just excluding the fact that Vintage is a format where very frequently you will main deck a Null Rod or a Collector Oof or something that just totally invalidates everything that your opponent is doing with artifacts. Shops has been a premier deck of the format forever. And so a new broken artifact being printed probably doesn't even make you change your deck list in any sort of major way. Maybe you throw in one extra Hercules recall. Or maybe you shift your deck a little bit so that you can play a Leovold or a Hull Breacher or some effect. Artifacts are not something new and scary in Vintage, and neither are drawing cards. Decks in the format are built to stop both of those things. So based on the early data here, I am not worried about this set warping Vintage in any capacity, and even if it does, the One Ring gets restricted and everyone goes on with their lives, I'm not worried about Vintage. Okay, let's go ahead and move on to the format that I know best, and that's Legacy. And let's start with the One Ring, because I think that'll be quicker and easier. Of the 61 5.0 deck lists that we got, only 5 of them contained copies of the One Ring. Perfectly reasonable number. In Legacy challenges over the weekend, and something to keep in mind as an aside here is that one of these was a showcase challenge, which is a little bit smaller and maybe more inbred than a normal event. We're not going to get into the minutia of that. We're going to treat them both as Legacy challenges moving forward. In one of the 2 Legacy challenges this weekend, it put up 3 results in the top 32, and in the other, it put up 4 in the top 32. Not scary numbers, but in one of those challenges, it did have the first, second, and third place standing at the end of the Swiss rounds. Now, the deck didn't win the tournament or anything like that, but that is a pretty impressive run for pilots on different builds of the deck. Let's take a general look at what these decks are going to look like. 2 of the 3 decks that did well with the One Ring were dedicated combo decks that looked approximately like this, where the general game plan is to combo off via Paradox Engine, repeatedly untapping the One Ring, allowing you to play your entire deck. There's a lot of disagreement about what exactly the build is supposed to look like. Some of the builds will play something like Lion's Eye Diamond, which can kind of function as a pseudo Black Lotus when you have the One Ring and Mystic Forge. But the builds haven't really settled yet. This deck looks to be very powerful, but if you kind of take a look at how many artifacts it's playing, a Null Rod, for example, is very scary against a deck like this one. The other deck that did well was actually a Bomberman deck, and by that we mean Oriox Salvagers combo, which goes infinite with Lion's Eye Diamond, and then you can kill any number of ways, very frequently with a Walking Ballista. This deck played 3 copies of the One Ring in the main deck here, and also tested out another new card that we otherwise haven't really seen. Within the specific context of this deck, this is a great way to go and find various pieces of your combo as well as the One Ring itself. Now, the One Ring is getting tested in basically everything in Legacy. It's getting jammed into combo decks, into control decks, into stompy deck lists. But at least as far as early tournament results go, it looks like only the dedicated combo decks with the One Ring are performing very, very well. So I would have my eye on the One Ring for Legacy decks moving forward. This is absolutely a metagame player, maybe a metagame changer, but again, artifact decks being good in Legacy isn't something new, and decks like 8cast have been probably the best deck in Legacy for quite some time, or at least in contention for that title. So, is the One Ring changing Legacy? Yes, absolutely. Is it changing it to a degree that is unhealthy? As long as we can keep the win percentage of these artifact combo decks in check, the answer is no, the One Ring is perfectly fine by Legacy standards, at least for now. Alright, and now let's move on to this little man, Orcish Bowmasters. And I think I want to start with some raw data first, because the data is actually a little scary this time around. Of the league results that we got, 26 of the 61 decks that 5-0'd were playing Orcish Bowmasters. That is approximately 43% right there, which is a legitimately scary number given the just crazy range of things that you can play in Legacy. Orcish Bowmasters is not taking up half, but is like on that trajectory as far as, winningest decks go. Surely it's just the league results, though, right? Yeah, totally. In one of the Legacy challenges, Orcish Bowmasters was in 16 of the 32 decks, and in the other, it was in 13 of 32 deck lists, for a total of 29 out of 64 of the possible slots over the weekend, which again is not quite half. And that has me a little bit sweaty. Here's a little Reddit post that I think will give you some perspective. If roughly half of the lists are playing Orcish Bowmasters, that's the same amount that are playing cards like Wasteland or Ponder or Brainstorm or Pyroblast, and is rivaling Surgical Extraction, one of the best generic cards of all time for the purposes of Legacy, as well as format staples like Force of Will. And when we start looking at the decks that were doing really well in the Showcase Challenge in particular, decks like Death's Shadow and Grixis Delver that were playing Orcish Bowmasters, their win percentages were very high. Shout out to PVDH and the Legacy Data Collection Project. Consider following them both on Twitter if you don't already. The thing that has me most concerned about Orcish Bowmasters in Legacy right now is the fact that it just goes in everything. In my mind, there's 4 different types of Legacy decks. You have tempo decks like Delver, dedicated control decks that are looking to go bigger than Delver, you have your combo decks, and you have your Stompy or Prison decks, okay? Tempo, combo, control, Stompy. And Orcish Bowmasters fits into all of those. And let me show you a little bit of the range that this card has had in tournament results. First up here, we see Orcish Bowmasters in an Elves shell in this wonderful, Fiend Artisan mid-range deck, Newton Elves or some offshoot of it, whatever you want to call it at this given time, where it's operating as a fair card that pings and kills creatures while punishing blue cantrips and provides great fuel for something like a Grist. So this is a fair adjacent grindy deck list utilizing Orcish Bowmasters. Next up, we have sort of what I expect to be the new face of Delver, Grixis Delver, featuring Orcish Bowmasters. This is kind of normal Grixis Delver with a couple of Orcish Bowmasters fit in. One thing that I do want to note here is previous Legacy staple Snuff Out is now quite less good than it used to be, because it does not kill Orcish Bowmasters. And as I continue to talk about this card, you'll probably see that that is actually a really big deal. Next up, let's take a look at a dedicated control deck list where Orcish Bowmasters is just a removal spell / a blue cantrip punisher, and technically it also has the ability to pick up some equipment a little bit later on. notice just the insane range where Orcish Bowmasters just goes in everything. And to make sure this point is clear, when I say everything, I really mean everything. This is Orcish Bowmasters in the sideboard of Reanimator, where it is literally just being played as Orcish Bowmasters. It's not like this is Orcish Bowmasters plus some other thing that makes my opponent draw a whole bunch of cards and triggers it a whole bunch of times. We're not getting Q with Echo Vions or anything like that here. This is just the card is generically good enough that if you are playing black, it goes in your deck. And here I just as easily could have put a Black Stompy deck up on the screen as well, right? Some of the things that I've tried out on my channel recently. Orcish Bowmasters is so generically good that it is slotting into rough of half of Legacy's decks right now. So as far as Legacy goes, I would say the One Ring is probably like archetype empowering. It is going to really power up the Mystic Forge deck that was a fringe metagame player played by a couple of pilots previously, and that will be a deck to watch in the future. We'll see how its win rate stabilizes over the next couple of weeks as people learn that this is a deck they're going to need to respect, and we start seeing more null rods and such, or maybe pithing needles to just stop the One Ring from drawing cards. And people might adapt in other ways, playing something like our good friend Leovold, or maybe Hull Breacher that stops our opponents from drawing cards. Narset is very good as well, as your opponent can't necessarily pressure a Planeswalker version of this card. Orcish Bowmasters, though, has me worried. The One Ring is generically good, but it does cost 4 mana by Legacy standards, whereas Orcish Bowmasters is a generically good card that costs 2 mana, and it's good against a wide range of deck. It's good against anything that has cantrips, it's good against anything that has small creatures that are X1s. And when you kind of think about the Legacy metagame, most decks are going to fall into one of those two categories. And if you're playing something like Grist that cares about the tokens, that gives you another different reason to play it as well. If you blink this thing, you get to do it again. The early numbers that this card is putting up are concerning, and definitely it's on my to watch list moving forward. When I think about something that put up this strong of generic results across so many different archetypes, I am thinking back to the companion era of Legacy, where, you had Lurrus Delver decks, you had Lurrus control decks, you had Lurrus and Zerta combo decks, and I don't think anyone should be calling for bans right now. I think that is just completely unrealistic. We have hardly had these cards for any events yet, but Legacy has changed. I just think that is a fully accurate statement. And I think if you are trying to continue to play the Legacy deck that you were playing 2 or 3 weeks ago without making any changes to the form to your deck, I think you are going to be miserable. So imagine that you are a Death and Taxes pilot. If you are walking into matches with a whole bunch of X1 creatures in your flex slots, you are probably going to have a very bad time as Orcish Bowmasters goes and tears apart your creatures in the early game. If you are going into matches without changing your sideboards at all, the One Ring deck is probably going to obliterate you because that deck is scary unless you interact with it 2 or 3 times in the early turns of the game. So as the next couple of weeks move forward, I encourage you to think back to cards your deck has played in the past and think if they're going to be anything that might be suited for a comeback. So for example, if Orcish Bowmasters is clogging up the ground and destroying X1 creatures, maybe you play a big booty flyer that can go and get through. Or if the One Ring's indestructibility is meaning that your Meltdown isn't answering everything you need to answer it anymore, like maybe you start thinking about various cards that can exile artifacts rather than just destroy them. So I've tried to keep this little video as data-driven as I possibly could, but the last thing that I want to talk about is the texture of games with the One Ring and Orcish Bowmasters. I feel like some of our other banned cards in this format have completely invalidated gameplay options for other decks. So, for example, Oko's +1 ability was just so incredibly good and versatile that it was basically impossible to play prison-based decks and creature-based decks while it existed in the format. And similarly, cards like Deadhorde Arcanist or Ragavan Nimble Pilferer spiraled games quickly, and when backed by Daze or Force of Will, just immediately ended the game. The One Ring doesn't immediately end a game, and in fact, one of its abilities is only really good if you pass the turn, right? And if you are going to build a dedicated combo deck around untapping the One Ring, you are playing a large number of cards like a Voltaic Key or Manifold Key or Grim Monolith that don't actually do anything on their own. So this card requires a support network. Orcish Bowmasters does not require any sort of support network at all. It just does its thing. But is its thing actually winning the game on its own? In most cases, the answer is no, right? If you're playing against a fair creature deck, like Orcish Bowmasters is going to slap, going to kill a creature on the way in, and if you put two bodies, the Orc and the Bowmasters itself, in front of another creature, you probably get a 2-for-1 with that. But your Death and Taxes opponent or whatever isn't going to be cantripping, so that's all Orcish Bowmasters is, a good value-oriented removal card. And I'm totally good with value-oriented removal cards being good in Legacy. That means the gameplay is slow enough and interactive enough where that's a thing that you want to be doing. So if we do a vibe check on Orcish Bowmasters, and this is very unscientific, I personally feel like while if you're playing a deck full of X1 creatures, like you are going to have a bad time versus this card. And if you are playing a cantrip deck that has no removal options, you're going to have a bad time against this card. This is a card that feels like it has okay gameplay patterns. It's perhaps maybe a little toxic that the best answers to an Orcish Bowmasters is an opposing Orcish Bowmasters, and you're going to get into some really weird pseudo-mirror, do I play mine out to punish cantrips, or do I hold mine to answer the opposing Orcish Bowmaster situations? But unlike something like Ragavan or Deadhorde Arcanist or Oko, I don't feel like this card coming into play on turn 2 just ends the game. Does it warp the game? Yes, frequently. Is it incredibly good? Yes, frequently. Are there other times you play it and it's a shitty 2 power plus a ping? Yes, also frequently. So I have my eye on this card. I think this card is actively warping the format, but I don't know that we are at a stage where what is happening is actually unhealthy and is promoting a format that is unfun. I have very much enjoyed testing out every Orcish Bowmaster deck under the sun, and I felt like the gameplay has been interesting, and I felt like my opponents had counterplay for the most part. And when you start getting into ban talk territory, it's because people are trying to adapt and can't. People are trying to beat it and they can't. And Orcish Bowmasters still feels like it is in the beatable realm of legacy playability to me, at least at this time. So I think that's really what I have to say about the cards in Legacy. Kind of quick caveat here. There are other cards having an impact on Legacy, but those cards are not anywhere at the same level as the One Ring in terms of playability and potential to warp the format. While 4th Aerlingas might have a place in an initiative shell or a like Jeskai Delver deck as a finisher, or even as a finisher in a control deck list, it doesn't feel like anything like that will be unhealthy. But Phil, what about Modern? Okay, first of all, Modern isn't technically an eternal format. It's a non-rotating constructed format. But since you asked, here's some quick spark notes. Since I'm not an active Modern player myself, I don't want to do an analysis and get it wrong. But here's some general info. As far as the One Ring goes, which feels like the thing that you need to be concerned about in Modern particularly, it had 29 different league finishes, 5 O's, In one of the challenges over the weekend, it put up 9 different results, and in the other, it put up 13 results. So the One Ring might end up being problematic in Modern, but I'm not informed enough to give you a real data driven or just sort of gut feeling answer. But based on what I'm seeing on Twitter, people are definitely concerned about the One Ring's power level there. Today's video was me trying something very different from what I normally do, so let me know in the comments down below whether you like this video and this is something you might want to see in the future, or whether you'd prefer that I just stick fully to gameplay on this channel. Now, today's video was sponsored by moxfield.com and Cool Stuff Inc. If you end up wanting to check out any of my deck lists from the last week or two, trying out a bunch of these cards, I'll link those down below. And if you end up needing to go and buy any cards, consider checking out Cool Stuff Inc., where promo code ThrabenU will save you 5% on your order. Folks, truly let me know in the comments below what you thought of this video, as I'll use that to inform whether or not I should make more of this. And I hope you have a great rest of the day, and I hope you enjoy playing with your broken cards. Now, if you'll excuse me, I think it's time for me to go.